Welcome back to Liz Linehan's News You Can Use. And today we are talking about tolls. I'm here with Elizabeth Kynes, the Executive Vice President of the Yankee Institute, and Isabel Blank, Manager of External Affairs. That's kind of a big title.
Oh yeah, very fancy.
Manager of External Affairs. So would you consider this an external affair because you're coming to talk to us about this? I really appreciate you coming out and talking about tolls. You know, this has been such a hot button topic, and I think it's been politicized more than it needs to be. And when something is politicized, we tend to lose control of what is put out as fact. So I appreciate you being here today because I want to get the facts out, and we're going to look at both sides. As my viewers often know, I am a legislator on the fence. I understand that we need to do something about the Special Transportation Fund and that we do have some real concerns about our infrastructure, but I also know that bonding everything is going to be really expensive. So today as we talk, we'll get down to the nitty-gritty and explain to our viewers exactly what each proposal would mean and what we also don't know about each proposal, because we can talk about how they're not really fully fleshed out. So let's begin. First of all, tell me a little bit about the Yankee Institute and anything you want us to know about the research that you've done regarding tolls.
Yeah, so we are a nonprofit, bipartisan, or nonpartisan even, I guess people call us a think tank. We're a research organization here in Connecticut. We focus only on state policy, so our specialty is Connecticut, and we look at things through a free market lens. So you mainly will just see us focus on economic incentive or programs. We don't look at any social issues. So sometimes there are some issues that are really hot right now at the State House that that's not our bag. But tolls for us, it represents a huge economic crossroads for the state, and so that's why we've looked at it so closely. But you'll see we also do a lot of work in education, which I know is something you're very passionate about.
Absolutely, and thank you for mentioning that. You know, and so when you said we don't really hit on anything, any social issues, I was going to interrupt you and say, like vaccines? What do you think about vaccines? But I'm not going to do that. I won't put you on the spot like that, even though I just kind of did. So when you are, as the Manager of External Affairs, I imagine then that you talk to people a lot who might be on the fence the way I am. And is that something that you run into a lot?
Definitely. I think what's really exciting to me about this tolls debate is it's not a party line split. I mean, we're talking here. It's not a party split, and it's been made more partisan than I think it really is.
Which is the problem, right? I mean, and so we can sit here and say that there's not a partisan split, but we know that the media makes it look like it's a partisan split, that members of the minority party have made it look like there's a partisan split. And so that's a main reason why I wanted to do this, because it shouldn't be about politics. It should be about the best way to move our state forward. So with that, let's get into the nitty-gritty, okay? So there have been a few bills that came out of the Transportation Committee to implement tolls, but none of them really have a fully fleshed out plan. Do you want to speak to why that is?
There are consulting firms in the country who have worked with other states to research how much does it cost to implement tolls and what will the revenue generated be once you implement those tolls in states. We have found across the board that those estimates usually are far under the reality. So I'll just make up a number. Someone might say you're going to get $100 million a year if you institute 12 toll gantries in a state. And what we find in states like Illinois or even California, that revenue never hits that mark just because there are so many unknowns.
There's variables
in
everything we do, right? But it's also a fact that we can't really put forth a plan that says what gantries we're going to have, how many we're going to have, where they're going to be, until we pass a bill, and then it goes to the federal government in order for them to do an environmental study. Isn't that correct?
Well, also, something kind of a fun fact, there are several, we talk about New York and Massachusetts. So the Mass Pike is, that's where you see those 13 toll gantries in Massachusetts. Right. And then in addition to that, they've got 4 more tolls in the state. 3 are on bridges, and 1 is that like crazy tunnel under Boston to go to Boston Logan. That system has been grandfathered in. So the rules that apply to that stretch of road in Massachusetts won't apply today. So there are unknowns. To your point, when we submit our proposal to the federal government, there are unknowns with that as far as Could the toll be on things besides a fixed, like a bridge? Because a lot of times a toll, which you'll see in Northern California, most of their tolls are affixed to a bridge. So the Bay Bridge, a Golden Gate Bridge, and that money only goes to, say, the Golden Gate Bridge. Congestion tolling, we hear a lot about that. And again, there are so many unknowns when it comes to the federal government's involvement. Right. And I think it's hard to say, because I think about Virginia. I mean, when you drive in and around DC, there are very high toll prices because they have a congestion plan.
But let's clarify that for our viewers. The congestion tolling can actually be one of two things. So there's congestion tolling that says that you charge a higher rate during peak times. And from what Governor Lamont has said, it's only a few cents more, right? But then there are the Cadillac plans of the congestion tolling, which means that it's based on the current congestion on the road at that time to use one particular lane for, in my opinion, an astronomical amount of money. Let's say there's one particular lane that you can use during on peak and the traffic is so bad, you could pay $30 to travel down that lane and miss all the traffic. That is not what Connecticut is talking about. So there's some misinformation there as well. So and I say we meaning legislators, not necessarily that I'm backing this plan, because as you know, I'm not there yet. That's what this whole conversation is about. But there is not that type of congestion tolling, the Cadillac lane, where you're going to pay $30 to $40 if you're stuck in a traffic jam. And would you agree with that statement?
Well, the only thing is there are so many unknowns. So we were talking earlier, I've spent a lot of my adult life in California, and I think a lot of people think of Los Angeles, especially where I lived, as this high traffic area, and it is. But what's interesting, we don't, in Los Angeles, they don't have any tolls except for express lanes. So you make that choice to drive in an HOV lane if you're a single car driver instead of having multiple people in the vehicle. In Southern California, the prices really, to your point, are not significantly higher. In NorCal, the price is more astronomical. So to be honest, I mean, there are so many unknowns again, as far as the implementation of congestion tolling in Connecticut. Right. I think that's what is concerning, I think, right now to a lot of legislators, because they don't have all the facts.
That's absolutely correct. And so what I have said personally for the past 2 years now is that I cannot make a decision on tolls until I see the entire economic impact on our residents. So this is where I do my handy dandy fist things. So I say, first of all, that sitting in traffic costs us a certain amount of money per year, right? There's all these think tanks that come out with what does congestion cost you, what do potholes cost you, right? And it comes out to something like $600 a year on residents. Leaving that aside, okay? I need to look at what is the average resident going to pay in tolling to get to work. And then I want to compare that to, and we'll get more into the other idea on the board now, which is to bond our way out of this mess that we're in. What is that going to cost us, not only in principal payments, but also in interest? So what does that equate to per year? So here's this other fist. And then additionally, if we look at tolls, I always said we can't just look at what the pricing is going to be, because I'm advocating for a further reduction in your income taxes, a straight tax credit. Would there be a lesser amount for tolling for people who can't afford it? Would there be, or do we have an income limit? All of these things that we're looking at, would there be a small business tax credit? These are things that we actually can't get that information from what we have currently on the table now. And that is because anything that we pass out of the legislature or do not pass needs to then go to the federal government to do what they call an environmental study. Now, with that said, an environmental study is not what everyone is thinking when they're hearing this. It doesn't mean what happens to the bunnies and the duckies. An environmental study really means, what are the effects on these secondary roads? What's going to happen to businesses? All this information, right? So would you agree with the statement that whatever we pass this year, if we pass anything, is not going to be the final product?
It really all depends. I mean, that's the issue, right? We don't know what the final product could be. And I think that passing a bill in order to find out more information is really loaded, right?
But how do we find out the information without passing the bill?
So one quick aside, just there's more information available, I think, than people realize. So outdoor media companies do monthly research on how many cars pass certain points on freeways and local roads. So two outdoor companies in our state, large national companies that operate in Connecticut, every month they release reports. And so what's interesting when I go to, whether it's a town hall or I talk to constituents just out in the field, they always say 95 is awful, 95 is horrible. The most trafficked two roads consistently every month in our state are number 1, 84, and number 2, 91. Usually 95 falls in number 4 or 5 in the top 5.
Because keep in mind that there's less lanes there. Right. I mean, so we're not just talking about the amount of cars on the road, we're talking about the roads themselves, which then begs the question, do we need money to widen those roads? Governor Malloy's big thing was that he was going to widen 95 for a ton of money that I just couldn't get behind because we didn't have it. If we institute tolls on 95, we'd be able to do that.
But I would say people who ride Metro North to work every day would say, please prioritize our trains. So I think we're getting into a situation where, we do have a revenue problem, a very significant revenue problem. And we also have because we have to prioritize spending no matter what. That's just smart government. But how do we prioritize? So I think that's something that as a resident of Connecticut, we've seen again and again, that we're prioritizing a certain line that maybe fewer people take than another line of a train or a bus. And the other thing, the interesting thing about those outdoor media companies, consistently, local roads rank 3rd or 4th. So most months, local roads, so this is like what you're talking about, local roads that we, maybe take from town to town, they get more traffic than 95, as far as a volume. So going back to your point about, we do an environmental study to see what the impact is on local roads. We already know our local roads are inundated with cars.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate. So the local roads, we know that through the billboard companies that they're congested, but it doesn't say why. It doesn't tell us if a car is taking the local roads so they don't have to take the highway. It could be that they're going to businesses in that area or they live in that area. So we have to remember that too. We don't know until it is actually studied if gantries and tolling itself is going to drive people to secondary roads. That's part of the environmental study. So what the environmental study would do is it would force the DOT to go into communities and hold forums and town halls and to discuss this with people and collect that data in order to know that. So once again, we're back to there are bills on the table that don't tell us enough. That's why it's difficult for me to make a decision. But when we look at the actual cost of it, let's get to some numbers that the governor put out. So he has now said that his proposal, he wants no more than 50 gantries. Gantries placed every 6 to 7 miles on 84, 91, 95, and 15. And each gantry would be about 25 to 30 cents or 4.4 cents a mile. Okay. With that, because I represent Cheshire, Southington, and Wallingford, I looked at some of the costs yearly of what it would take in order to get to work 5 days a week. My husband works in Danbury, so I chose Waterbury to Danbury. That's $51.20 a month or $614 a year. New Haven to Hartford, which would be essentially what I would take to get here. Yeah, it would fluctuate. $68.80 a month or $825 a year. So my husband travels from Cheshire to Danbury. He works in Danbury. So I chose Waterbury to Danbury. And that would be $51.20 a month or $614 a year. And for my trip, essentially we chose New Haven to Hartford, even though that would be on 91. I would travel 84. 91 if 84 is backed up. That's on peak would be $1.72 per trip, $68.80 a month or $825 a year. That's significant for someone in my position, and I think in the positions that many of my constituents are in. So I'm very concerned about that. But then again, remember we talked about I look at the whole nut, right? So deficient roads in Connecticut cost motorists $6.1 billion annually, or $676 per motorist. So I'm not saying that fixing our roads and bridges will make that down to zero. It won't. It will, I'm sure, significantly reduce it. But we need to look at what money we're putting out every month. I'm concerned weekly, monthly. As we said before we sat down, and I've said many times on the internet, this would cause us to have more grilled cheese for dinner than we've ever had before. I recognize that, and I think a lot of the people I represent feel that way. There's also the problem of long-term debt, and that's something that hasn't been discussed. Everybody seems to be focused on what is it going to cost me per trip, per day, per week, per month, per year. Let's talk about the policy behind bonding our way out of the Special Transportation Fund. Now, the Special Transportation Fund is going to be insolvent by 2024, even with the complete phase-in of the new car sales tax. The Yankee Institute, I don't want to call it your think tank, but the Yankee Institute has been very strong about our need to look at our long-term liability. And that's something that I've been focused on for years as well. So without tolling, the only other idea, well, there's two other ideas on the table. We could do nothing and be completely insolvent by 2024. Can you explain to our viewers what it means if the Special Transportation Fund is insolvent?
So there's a ratio of liabilities to the funding of the fund. So if debt liabilities are too high and funding is decreased, then the fund cannot support itself anymore.
And currently, our liabilities are outpacing our revenue. So essentially, when the Special Transportation Fund goes insolvent, are we able to fix our roads and bridges? Are we able to look at, the Mixmaster? My husband travels on the Mixmaster every day. That thing terrifies me.
Wow. Yeah. So he commutes from Waterbury to Danbury?
Yeah. And so we drive through that and I look at it and I think, oh my God, it's terrifying. So I recognize that we need to fix these things. But bonding is going to increase that liability that we have. If we put money into the Special Transportation from bonding, we are not getting any out-of-state motorists to pay for that. And so can you talk a little bit about what you see your concerns are with the prioritized progress plan, which is being floated by the minority party? I want to point out that currently there is no bill that came to the Transportation Committee to institute the prioritized progress plan. So we're not even 100% sure of what it means. But if we bond $800 million, which would equal $1.2 billion after interest, how long will that last for us and what will that get us? Are you able to answer that question?
So one thing that I would say is in all cases, we really need to look at spending at the same time as we're looking at revenue. It's really difficult and a problem if we're asking the residents of our state to continue filling a bucket with a hole in it. So currently, what we spend on transportation per mile is significantly higher than most other states, and that has a lot of factors are involved in what we're spending per mile.
So I'm gonna interrupt you for just 1 second, if you don't mind. So if you look at the numbers as a whole, yes, we spend more per mile. However, isn't that because there are other costs lumped into that when we talk about the way Connecticut spends, because of the way our government is set up, not because it's not an apples to apples comparison between Connecticut and other states. For instance, New York has the MTA, they have their own authority. So things can be disaggregated to show how much you spend per mile. Connecticut doesn't have that. So all of these DOT things are kind of lumped into that. So because we're looking at laying it all out on the table and being totally forthcoming, can you also say that that's not an apples to apples comparison? So until we have the ability to disaggregate that data and find out what we spend per mile the same way other states do, that's kind of not a real good, comparison.
I don't think that's necessarily true, just based on the studies that I have read, and I can definitely follow up with you afterwards.
That'd be great, and I'll do the same.
Okay, perfect, yeah.
I think one issue, so there's a national, which I think Lamar has talked about, there's a national study that was done that kind of placed Connecticut kind of at the bottom of the country when it comes to administrative costs. And this comes up a lot. The reality is, when you have a state with such high fixed costs as Connecticut does, so more than half of our budget is related to fixed costs of Medicaid.
Not necessarily DOT related. So we have problems beyond this. This is just one slice of that.
We do.
Please go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
So I think, one thing I think about, and this is where, so I think our teacher pension liability is like 1.5 billion. Is that right? Yeah, so right around there. Just making sure, because there's like 1.8, 1.4. I look at those numbers and I think about, so I'm just going to this all relates, so I'll get to this, but our teachers aren't eligible for Social Security. The pension is all they have. This is a promise we have made to our public servants.
Yes.
But because of funding issues in our state, the rate we're going, you talk about the transportation fund being insolvent. My worry is that our state will be insolvent. How will we keep our promises when you've got, state employees, I think is 1.4 or 1.5, our teachers' pension plan is 1.8. That far surpasses the transportation requirements of our state. You talk about priorities. In my mind, I think I want to make sure that a retired teacher can put food on the table. That's a priority over, can I get to New York faster? I mean, when we talk about, real life, situations, and when I look at your district, because actually I go to a salon in your district that I love very much. So I'm down there quite often. You are bordered by freeways. Very few people in your district can go to work without getting on an interstate.
That's true.
They will be bombarded by these toll gantries. Whereas, so I live in a different part of the state right now, east of Hartford, and I could get to work without getting anywhere, near a toll gantry. So I think beyond the nuts and bolts and the partisanship that's going on right now, I look at the affordability crisis in our state, and I look at the fact that at the rate we are going, and both sides of the aisle will agree with this, we can't keep the promises to our public sector employees. So I would say, let's look at innovative solutions to reduce some of these fixed costs. Let's keep our promises, but I think there is still a lot of room to be able to fund transportation needs.
And so this brings up the problem that when we're looking at tolls, we can't just look at tolls in a vacuum. It has to be the entire status of our state. And there are some major issues, and they're not something that happened overnight. It was over 70 years that this has been brewing, and it was done by Republican governors, Republican legislatures, and Democratic legislatures alike. And so that is one of my main concerns. If we institute tolls, let's boil it down. If we institute tolls, I'm very concerned about the everyday affordability. Very concerned. If we do nothing, I'm concerned about our ability to move our state forward in a safe and productive manner. Transportation is a big deal, and as a matter of fact, the tolls plan is backed by the Connecticut Council of Municipalities for that purpose. A strong transportation system is important not only for getting to work, but for businesses to do their work. But I'm really concerned about our long-term liabilities. And if we bond $800 million, that is just to keep our bumps and potholes and shore up some bridges. That does nothing to look at the long-term transportation needs of our state. And so my concern is that we will be bonding so much money that it is going to be unrecoverable debt. And my kids are going to be saddled with so much debt for years to come, and we're never going to be able to get out of this hole. I know that because I am essentially a one-income family, we've discussed this before, that my child care costs are at or sometimes even more than what I bring home as a state legislator. And so we're basically a one-income family. I know that there's a tipping point for us. But I also know that when I go to a store and someone offers me 20% off in order to open this credit card, I say, no, my long-term debt is not worth it. Why aren't we doing that for the state? Why isn't anyone besides, and I hate to be partisan, but it's really just been the message of the Democrats, why isn't anyone standing up and saying we can't afford to bond our way out of this?
That's a really good question. I think there are a couple of things going on. One, it's really tempting to look at something like tolls as a silver bullet. It's really tempting to look at a state like Florida and say, look at how much money they generate from hotel taxes and tourism taxes.
We're
they
not
get to pay
Florida.
things. Well, exactly. And we don't want to be Florida. I mean, I know we have a lot of people moving there, but I don't want to live in Florida.
I don't want to be Florida.
I chose to live in Connecticut.
Right.
So I think that's one thing, and going back to your point about, apples to apples comparison, I do think, we appreciate studies done by national groups and state groups, whether they're on, in the free market world or not, whether they, are more progressive groups. We like to read this information to get different points of view. But one thing when I look at some of these studies, and it's so tempting to say, well, New York does this or Massachusetts does that, we need to just look within our state boundaries and say, what is best for Connecticut? And at this point, we have like I said before, a revenue crisis. We do have in most counties an out-migration problem. So we've got this problem where we don't have the revenue coming in, but we're increasing spending. And I think part of that is because, as legislators, you want to care for your constituents. You want to meet their needs. You want to build these new schools. You want to do all these things, but it takes money. And because our state has such high fixed costs, there's just not enough revenue to do all the things that all the legislators want to do to take care of their constituents.
Right.
So I think, to be honest, I don't know why that question's not being asked. I wish that more people were. I think Democrats, I think that they have great solutions. I mean, we've talked to different Democrats over the years who've had wonderful solutions on ways to, either increase revenue or to reform spending. But for whatever reason, I think, there was something you said at the top of this that just has really stuck with me. This is not a partisan issue, really. I mean, it affects every Connecticut resident. But the media, for whatever reason, I mean, probably because, what did Hearst say? If it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
It sounds more exciting when you can get people in a room and they fight. I really think that actually, if we really sat down with Democrat and Republican alike, I think that the sentiment would be the same. It is that we want good for Connecticut. I mean, I remember one time Josh Elliott called in on a radio interview that our investigative reporter was doing, and I so appreciate what Representative Elliott said at the end. He said, just like Yankee Institute wants good for Connecticut, so do I. And I respect that, and I believe him. I believe that he wants to do what's best for Connecticut, just like we do. We just have different ways of getting there. Right. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, that's not what's being played in the media, and we're not having conversations where we come together and say, look, we made a promise to our public servants that we have to keep. We have to find a way to do that. We do have very high fixed costs, which makes us unique when you look at a state like Tennessee or Texas. Right. But also, it's like, things like tolls are not a silver bullet. And so to your point, until we have all the facts on the table, why do we have bills that could change where the money is fungible?
But the problem is that we just can't have everything on the table simply because we are dependent on the federal government to decide what we can do, to make sure that we're not violating the Commerce Clause, that we are doing things that are constitutional. We don't know that. And the federal government can't give us that information until we pass a bill authorizing that to happen. So we're locked. So if the legislature passes tolls this year, does that mean that tolls is a done deal?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I mean,
anything's possible in the legislature. What I would recommend to the legislature is if they are to pass a tolls bill, which I really personally would not like to see happen, but if they are going to pass a tolls bill, there should be some amendment in the bills that are on the table that says if the federal government decides that tolls have to be a certain way and we're not okay with that way, it should kill the bill.
And so that is ultimately what we're being told as legislators, that there will have to be another vote. That once we send this vote off to this package off to the federal government, they will come back to us after all of the environmental study is done. Remember, not bunnies and duckies. It's about what happens, what's going to happen to our local roads, to our businesses, and to our residents. When that comes back, then we have to vote to implement it. Is that not something you see in the current bill?
I don't.
I don't. So. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is we know the guidelines put forth by the federal government. We know, things like the Mass Pike have been grandfathered in. We can't replicate that here. We know what constitute congestion pricing. I mean, we see all that. We know the different types of tolling that are allowed. So you've got the fixed and the different things we've talked about. I also think maybe there hasn't been one federal environmental study or one state study that's the most recent that talks about the impact on local roads. But I think the studies that are being done in the private sector show us the environmental impact on local roads.
But regardless, the federal government requires that. So there's no getting around that. It's not that. So let's kind of go into a fact or fiction lightning round, okay? I'm not planning. If I had one, I would. I did not plan for this, so I'm just gonna think of questions, and you could hit me with some too if you want. So first off, there was the mistruth that if we institute tolls, we lose federal funding. You agree with me that that's false?
Well, that's border tolls.
Yes.
Right, but everyone is saying, the media comes out, and some of the opponents of tolls have said, tolls will make it so that we lose federal funding. That's not true, correct?
Wow.
So if we, roads that were previously turnpikes, I think they're called, if we were to resort back to that, then we would lose the federal funding for those roads.
But tolls in general does not stop us from getting federal money.
It depends on the plan.
That's fact, right? Okay. So if we were going to institute tolls, we could do it in a way that would not jeopardize our federal funding.
Yes, you could.
Okay. The second one, I'm trying to think of what other things that are out there, that the gantries will be so plentiful that you cannot possibly get on or off a highway without paying a toll.
I think for a resident in your district would be very difficult.
So if they are every 6 to 7 miles, and there are, I think it may be difficult, but it's not impossible. If there's a gantry every 6 to 7 miles, if you look in my district, there's maybe 2 miles in between exit 26 off of 84 to go to 691. Then there's another mile that goes to exit 28 in Southington, or West Street. And then it's another 2 or 3 miles after that to Queen Street. So it's not impossible. I agree that it'll be difficult, but if we're looking at the actual choosing the words carefully, it will not be impossible to get on the highway without paying a toll.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say to that is, California, I went and looked at a map. They have 13 toll gantries, like traditional toll gantries. Mm-hmm. And then they do have quite a few, the kind of HOV lane, the express lanes. Why do we need 50? Massachusetts has 13.
So
why do we need 50?
I did pose that question. I posed that question to James Redeker, former commissioner of the DOT. And the reason for that many gantries is to reduce the traffic on the secondary roads. That they know that the more gantries you have, the less likely you are to go off into those secondary roads. So while some places have less gantries, higher cost, Connecticut was looking to have more gantries, lower costs, so that people don't go off into secondary roads.
Would installing that many gantries, though, increase the cost of implementation and then the administrative cost to run each one and to run fiber optic cable to each one?
So I'm sure it would, absolutely. And that is a question that is really important when we get the study back to see what will this actually cost. Once again, we're going back to the fact that how do I possibly make a decision without all the information when we just can't have all the information? So I have to be guaranteed that there will be another vote before the legislature before I can make a decision on what my vote's going to be. But let's go to a couple of other different questions. It is estimated that 40% of the tolls will be paid by out-of-state residents. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I disagree with that.
You disagree. Why is that?
I think that's an inflated number that we have seen floated in states like Illinois. They don't get near as high as, because it's the same consulting firms that do these same studies, and they consistently overestimate the cost for out-of-state drivers.
Do you know by what percentage they overestimate? Do you have a number of what you think?
As high as 20%.
Okay, so even if we're getting 20% paid by out-of-state residents, isn't that 20% less than Connecticut residents have to pay?
Well, so one thing I would ask, and this is something that groups like the ACLU have floated. If you say that you have a plan and Connecticut residents get a lower price, that's great. But that is a discriminatory practice. Not everyone has the credit to have a bank account. Not everyone is, they might be a resident, but they're not a legal alien. I mean, there are different statuses for immigration. So not everyone has access to a debit card or credit card to apply for that, because that's the way that we
Yes.
designate who gets that reduced pricing. So I think one thing, and this is me speaking, not the Yankee Institute, but I look at things like an Easy Pass. Like I have an Easy Pass for another state, obviously. And I feel very fortunate that I have a bank account and I can go in and I can set up auto withdrawal. Not everyone can do that.
I will tell you right now that I would be concerned about auto refill on my own.
I am right now.
What if I'm on a grilled cheese week? Right? And that's concerning to me.
It's been an issue in New York with people's auto refill being a huge issue, and they've gotten their registrations revoked.
Yeah, I've lived in New York for a few years, and I was making, we've talked about this, I was in entertainment, not making a lot of money. We know entertainment does not pay. No. And then I went into politics. What was I thinking? So there were times when I was terrified that my bank account would go negative because it is that auto refill. These are real concerns. But then I have to bounce back. What about the other concerns that I'm going to be paying for the first installment into the Special Transportation Fund that will simply keep our roads and bridges as is and doesn't do any real improvements? I'll be paying for that for 20 to 30 years. That's scary. So what are we left with?
Well, so one thing, I've lived in several states, and we talked about this, like as of you. I've lived in states where I didn't pay a property tax on my car. So California, you don't pay that. I've lived in states with lower state income tax. I've lived in this state, which is higher. I will say in Connecticut, across the board, you've got fairly higher sales tax. It's not like in New Hampshire, we don't have sales tax. We have really high alcohol tax, and I just want to say no wine at Trader Joe's. It's very upsetting to me.
I will make note of that.
Yes, write it down.
Okay. Like, hold on. Okay, go ahead. I'm listening. Go ahead.
For all. I've obviously high property tax on my car, high if you own a home, high tax. So my question would be, let's take a step back. Where is all that money going? I mean, when you look at just nationwide, when you look at the volume of taxes paid by states, we are classified. NPR, KCRW yesterday said that Connecticut was a high tax state. So that's a fact.
But we can say that is pretty much fundamentally because of the way our system is set up, in that property taxes rule. We don't have a system which utilizes the money appropriately because it all falls on individual towns. We need to go to a better taxation system, and that doesn't happen here in Connecticut like it does in other states.
I think we have such high liability. Yeah. I mean, again, going back to the services that we get. I mean, in some towns, you have to pay for trash pickup. Some towns, like I lived in a city in Connecticut where you didn't have to. But it's the fact that our state and our towns have such high fixed costs. And so I think until you address that, again, I want to reiterate, you address that while keeping your promises to your public servants. Until you can nuance or figure out that nuance, I just think that this is, you've said this before, and I think it's a great analogy. We're kicking the can down the road. You're passing this on to your kids. So instead of passing on like a house or a great inheritance, you're passing on this
debt. Right. And this terrifies me, because if we don't pay attention now, we're going to be in double jeopardy later. We think it's bad now if we are consistently bonding. And let's talk about the bonding, right? So Prioritize Progress wants to bond $800 million, which turns into $1.2 billion for every $800 million that we put in. That's a problem, but it's a bigger problem in that there's only a finite amount that we can bond. The governor wants to go on a debt diet, which I approve of, but we can't do that if we're not funding our transportation fund somehow other than tolls. So the general obligation bonds are the bonds that would be used to go into the special transportation fund. Those are bonds that are currently used for things like school construction, library construction, medical, community medical center construction, things like that. if we bond our way out of this special transportation fund problem, which is a short-term fix, this does nothing long-term, we would have to come back to the table to get $800 million more, and we'll have to keep doing that over and over again until we fundamentally fix our problems. What is that going to do to our ability to prioritize things like education, like we talked about?
Yeah. Also, what does that do to our rating as a state?
And that's going to cost. It's going to cost us more money to borrow. So we're borrowing money to fix a problem that we have to keep borrowing money to continue to fix because it's not a dedicated revenue stream. We are no longer going to be able to bond for. I'm just going to pick out school construction because my district is looking into school construction. We have, I think, our newest school in Cheshire was built in 1970. I mean, we're having problems. We have mold problems in the high school. We have issues. We need to construct schools. So that's all going to fall on local taxpayers when the state isn't able to put money into that. So you said often we have to look at how we're prioritizing. This is an issue. And this is going to be an issue for my district and other districts as well. So given this information, is the Yankee Institute, are you backing any particular plan?
Not like we said before, we have not seen details of plans, instead of tolls use this or modify. We actually haven't seen a comprehensive plan. We've heard, these myths about plans or proposals. And until we see, kind of where you are, until we see the details, we don't feel that it's smart for us to make a prescription or to recommend a prescription against tolls or, to change the toll plan as it is. So I think right now we're kind of working in the dark in that respect as far as seeing.
And as we all are, right? So let's trade shoes, okay? So you're the legislator, and you are, like me, very concerned about long-term debt, long-term liability. You understand that our liability is outpacing our revenue, but you also know that tolls are a big concern in our everyday affordability of the state. That vote comes up knowing that there are both problems. What do you do? How do you vote?
Isabel, what do you think? You work with legislators every day.
So I think that my issue with all of the tolling proposals, like you've said and we've talked about throughout this whole conversation, is we don't know a lot about what's happening. What we do know is we have a study done by an organization that I would say is not 100% reliable, just based on the estimates they've made in other states have come out incorrectly. And that's what we're basing a lot of these conversations on, about how much revenue we're going to get, how much installing the tolls will be, and that's all based on assumptions that we don't know what the federal government's going to say. So one thing with the tolling plans is we will probably have to bond just to implement the tolls in the first place. And then from there...
Or we could do that through a public-private partnership that the governor is talking about. So it might not be all bonding, but...
Well, with that, though, you're going to end up with what they have in Virginia. So we'll get
Right.
the money on the front end, and then that private company will have X number of years or however to recoup that money.
And there's still interest paid on that.
Right. And they're going to, just as we see in Virginia, they're going to charge tolls. I was down in Virginia recently going into the city at off-peak hours. The toll was $14.76. $14. This was not rush hour. And I'm going away, so rush hour would be coming south. That's what would happen if I think some of these public-private partnerships are a little nerve-wracking.
Okay.
I think the other thing, to your point, if I were a legislator, I would... I don't know that I would vote for this, because I would say, look at what the state has done in the past. So, like, for example, look at Route 11. We did a study on Route 11. I know it's a fascinating study, and that bridge to nowhere is really cool. But that bridge, I think that road, plan started, I think, in 1953. Went all the way until just a few years ago, and there were loads of environmental studies done on that road. The federal government finally said this is a dead road, and yet the state continued to put tens of millions of dollars in it. So I would almost say, I'm not voting for this And I'm not giving you one more cent until I see that we can spend the money we have on transportation wisely. I think right now we're mismanaging our money.
But then what happens? Then we're stuck and we've got nothing.
No, I think
So a no vote essentially puts things off for what could be years, which could make our situation worse. Legislators have to take that into account. And that's my concern. I would love to stand up and say, nope, not there yet. Keep working on it. But then we still have, the fund is insolvent. We don't have the dedicated revenue. We don't, we could go back to my lightning round idea that didn't exactly pan out, but it's been said that we're constantly raiding the Special Transportation Fund. I've been told that that's actually not true, that we did it once in 2003, but basically that the general fund has been subsidizing the Special Transportation Fund. So there's all these mistruths that I understand that we don't always spend our money the best, and we can continue to work on that. But why must we prove that we can do something before we make a move, when knowing that time it would take to prove it would ultimately put us more in the hole?
I think it's not a question of proving. It's a question of not wasting, stopping the waste. But to go back to that word prioritization, I think we work with lots of different constituents and lots of different groups around the country. I will tell you right now, we have families and teachers who say prioritize education over, a faster commute to New York City. We have people who say prioritize access to healthcare. So right now, transportation, I think a lot of it is the media. It's a buzzword, infrastructure, buzzword. It's a national, phenomenon that we're all talking about. But I think about people in your district. Maybe your district, and maybe as the representative of the people in your district, maybe transportation's not the priority for the people in Cheshire. Maybe education is. And maybe we have to make some hard choices and say we have to go without, or we have to, because I do think that we've spent a lot of money on bus lines and things like that maybe that money should have been diverted to our highways.
But are you concerned about safety?
I am. But that's why I say, why did we spend so much money on a bus line or a train line from Hartford to Springfield instead of repairing bridges? And those are the decisions where I say there's money right now that maybe is not being spent as wisely as it could be, and maybe legislators need to have more of a say in that, because I think what's happening right now with transportation money, it is fungible. You'll sign off on a bill, but then down the road, the money is spent on something different other than what you voted for.
Right.
And that needs to stop.
Right. So, but here we are again, and you didn't answer my question, so I'm going to make sure you get back to that.
I may have cut her off.
But here we are again. I have to vote one way or the other. My yes vote would mean, to the best of my understanding, my yes vote would mean that it would move it along to the federal government to start to do the environmental study, and would have to come back to the legislature for a full vote again for implementation. So we know what those variables are that we don't know right now. That's the first thing. A no vote would mean either we are bonding our way out of it and increasing our long-term liability in a way that is so outrageously unsustainable that I'm concerned about our ability to stay in the state, or we do nothing and we have the next Mianus River Bridge collapse, and we're still insolvent in our transportation fund. And so then people would need to raise the gas tax, which I'm completely against. There's no good answer. So in my attempt to educate my residents, my viewers, my constituents, I'm putting it all out on the table. This is why I don't know what I'm going to do. If you were going to have to do yes, no, or don't know, one phrase only, how would you vote?
No.
How would you vote?
No.
And you'd feel okay moving forward.
I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah, let's go.
So you just said you're completely against the gas tax, and I'm wondering why you're against an increase in a you're against an increase in a gas tax, but you would be potentially supportive of tolls.
Well, remember, we cannot say I'm supportive of tolls. I am not. I am on the fence, totally still working it out. The gas tax we have seen currently in Connecticut, the gas tax is not necessarily a shrinking revenue stream, but the projections are that it will be. And the gas tax just really doesn't give us much of anything. If we were to raise it by another 25 cents, it would get us, by another 1 cent, it would only get us $15 million. It's just not enough. It doesn't do enough. And it's something that could additionally, like tolls, make it more difficult for people to get to work, but it wouldn't give us the return on the investment there. And additionally, I mean, we are talking about it would only be by Connecticut residents. The amount of people, of out-of-state residents that fill up in Connecticut is minuscule because you can get from one end of our state to the other really, really quickly. So I like the idea of having at least 20% by your calculations, 40% by other calculations of out-of-state residents paying for using our roads. I mean, if I look at it and I have my monthly payments that I have to make, if someone came to me and said, hey, I'll pay 20% of your mortgage, I'm like, sweet, let's do it. Because I'm still going to be paying that
So
anyway.
just to pay,
Except you've added on to your house. So that 20% is only paying for what you've added on. So, if we even got 20% from out-of-state drivers, which I'm not convinced that we would, to be honest, but if we did, the cost to implement and administer these gantries and this system, to have an easy pass system for our state, for employees to run that, their pensions, their benefits, to do all of that, the cost just to administer and implement is astronomical. And so
Which is terrifying.
It is.
Which is terrifying. But at the same time, that old adage, you have to spend some money to make some money. Where are we going to be if we can look 20 years down the road on each one of these plans? What plan gets us better off 20 years down the road?
So that's just it. If out of state, in order to be sustainable, and like you're saying, getting money from out of staters, the cost of implementing the tolls, administering them, and all of those added costs have to be at least the cost we're getting from out of staters. Otherwise, why wouldn't you just increase a tax somewhere else to get the revenue?
And so that's a really great point. And so that's going to be what I'm going to email the governor's office and try to get some information on. Have you seen any information on whether or not that's a wash?
Meaning what? Sorry.
So the money that we take in from out-of-staters, how long it would take us to make that money back for the implementation and the building of the gantries and so on and so forth.
So the proposed amount of money that we'd be getting from out-of-staters has been different in different studies.
Right.
So it's again really unclear.
It is unclear. So what I would do in order to help myself make that decision, they say 40, you say 20, I'll look at 30. And because look, it's a study. We're not going to know until it happens. We make our best estimates. And we can do that. But I ultimately, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your conversation. I'm not sure I'm any closer to a decision.
We tried.
But I appreciate you taking the time to look at it from all sides, getting rid of the politics, talking about real numbers as best we have them, and talking about the lack of real numbers that we have. That's an important part of this. And so I have a lot of thinking to do. But I appreciate you both so much for being here. Is there anything last minute you want to do, you want to say to me to make a last minute plea for a no vote?
Ooh. I think just at a general level, it's really hard to ask taxpayers and the residents of Connecticut for more when we haven't really fully looked at our spending in the DOT. I think that, if someone came to me with asking for more money, say I gave my child, I don't have one, but if I had one, I gave them $10 to go to the grocery store and get me groceries, right? We're giving our money to the government and asking them to spend it wisely on our roads and on our infrastructure. And my kid comes back and bought some candy and I have no groceries. I wouldn't give my child $10 more and expect them to do the same. I would ask them to reform their choices. So I think that it's really difficult to, expect that our state is going to improve their spending without putting a little pressure on the situation.
That's a great analogy. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would say when that day comes to take that vote, I would ask that in your mind, because I know this person lives in your district because I've met them at my hair salon. I would ask that you picture a single mother of one child living in your district who right now $800 a month or a year or whatever crazy number people come up with would mean that her child couldn't have dance lessons or braces. It probably would mean there would be less doctor's visits. I just ask that you would think about that woman and just ask why we're taking more money and if it's worth it. Maybe it is. Maybe in the long term, this mother saying that, I can't afford X, Y, and Z for my daughter is worth it. But I would just ask that you think about, just like we were when we were younger, and literally if the MTA charged our credit card on the wrong day, it meant that I couldn't pay my rent without, going into debt. I would just ask, like, is it worth it to ask for more money from our residents today? Is it? And will our government, given their track record, will they be honest and spend the money the way that they're saying that they will? So I guess I would just ask that you think about that as you take that vote on that very personal level for that constituent. And that's what I would ask.
Okay, because you broke my heart on that story. But I do think
of that hair salon.
I know.
And you have wonderful people in Cheshire, so
we really do, and I appreciate you saying that. And thank you for doing your business in Cheshire. I believe that all Cheshire businesses should be. We'll talk about it after because I'm going for a haircut today, so we'll see if it's the same salon. Okay. But thank you very much for your time, and I really appreciate it. And I suppose if it comes to a vote, you'll see ultimately. And I've been known to sit there and agonize before I press that button.
We appreciate that.
Yeah,
and
we really do.
Official. We really are grateful that you take it seriously and that you do agonize and you talk to both sides. So we're grateful for you and your service.
I'll remember that come election time. So thanks so much. All right, and we're going to head it back to the studio. Thank you so much.